Hello and welcome to Fearless DIY Music. My name is Tristan Lass, and this is Kevin Gamble. And we're in the same room,
Hey.
just like we were a year ago, but at my place. Now we're at his place. We are separated by some considerable distance, which is why we don't make videos in person together very often. However, we are here once again, and I am here once again with a topic that I'm hoping will catch him off guard and make him upset somehow. But we'll see if that happens or not.
Only if it's irrational.
Yeah, there we go. All right. So, about 3 or 4 years ago, I watched a documentary about the band Mudhoney, one of the unsung heroes, trailblazers of the Seattle scene and grunge music. Some would say that the band has origins as the progenitors of grunge, dating back to Green River, which also included members of Pearl Jam, and also Mother Love Bone along the way. So, huge part of the Seattle scene. Mudhoney was a band that has not been given its due, I don't think, throughout history. But watching that documentary really opened my eyes to another subject that I think is really, really interesting. When Nirvana hit, Kevin and I were just Missouri boys who'd been listening mainly to very pedestrian music. Not completely. We were both into prog rock and things like that, which made us a little bit outside. Kevin's taste and my taste, though, were largely founded on, kind of mainstream stuff. And then Nirvana came along, and it was a big deal to us. And it was like, wow, this stuff kind of came out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. Now, the big takeaway that I had watching the Mudhoney documentary was that not only did it not come from nowhere, and not only was it, it wasn't as innovative as you might have thought, being from the Seattle area. People knew about Mark Arm and Mudhoney and Steve Turner and the rest of the band long before Nirvana was ever a blip on anybody's radar. And so what is my takeaway from watching that documentary? My takeaway is that Nirvana basically, I could say ripped off, but emulated. I would say they emulated, imitated, and followed the exact same path that was blazed by Mark Arm and Steve Turner and Matt Lukin and Dan Peters of Mudhoney. There are direct correlations in, I'm thinking of the song Negative Creep, actually is an active borrowing of two of Mark Arm's best songs, which basically, Touch Me, I'm Sick, because he says, I'm a creep, and I'm sick, negative creep, and then Daddy's Little Girl Ain't a Girl No More, Sweet Young Thing Ain't Sweet No More, their second single, for Sub Pop. And Sub Pop Records built their entire business model on Mark Arm and Mudhoney. They went all in, and Mudhoney was the band that made Sub Pop possible and gave them the inspiration to kind of even start and really take seriously the label. In 1988, Mudhoney was in Europe, blazing the trail for this new type of music coming out of the Pacific Northwest. That's 3 years before Kevin and I discovered this brand new thing called Nirvana. So my question is that, does Nirvana deserve to be taken down a few notches as far as being so original? I get that a lot of their music was a lot more anthemic, a lot more hummable, a lot more singable. We'll get to some other parts of the documentary which include intersections of Mudhoney's career and Nirvana's career. But my controversial take is Nirvana was just kind of like aping a lot of what Mudhoney did. Kevin, after seeing the documentary, do you have thoughts about that part of it?
Well, yeah, I don't want to jump ahead to too many aspects of it, but one thing that I will say that really I took away from that was just a sense of how much, Nirvana was like one part of a much bigger and active scene, and they were a newer fish swimming into this scene that wasn't that old, but had sort of established an identity. And so I think where we might end up differing on this take is that almost made me feel a little more sympathy for them, in the sense of, yeah, these were just basically kids in the middle of a scene without, this worldly perspective that we have gotten since, and the corporate takeover of Nirvana brought to the world. So I think you're right about the fact that they entered this scene and were influenced by this scene, and the scene permeated what they did. It almost made me think a little bit about, like, this is going to sound like a weird example, but Iron Maiden, where Steve Harris kind of took some elements from Pete Way, from UFO, some direct visual lifts of style and presentation and so forth, and then ran with it, and obviously took it a lot farther than Nirvana ever had the chance to take it. But it's kind of like, well, you can see the individual identity, but you can also see, yep, these were young kids who borrowed from what was in their environment. So yeah, I'll be interested to hear what you have to say about the rest of it and the other aspects of the doc.
Well, the thing about the borrowing is just like, it wasn't only, it was musical to a certain extent, but it was more the image, the stage, the stage presentation is uncanny. When you're watching this old footage of Mudhoney actually kind of making it long before Nirvana made it, you feel like you're watching a Nirvana show almost, because they did take that energy. Because
it looked like Nirvana.
And Kurt cut his hair when Mark Arm cut his hair into a bowl cut. Kurt Cobain cut his whole hair into a bowl cut. They had the same hair, during the bleached era and things like that. And it's just really, it really just jarred me, because I'm just like, oh my goodness, these things happen.
Yeah.
Now, what I want to talk about is, okay, so I think that Nirvana definitely, like, stole's the wrong word, but emulated or really, really, took a lot from the Mudhoney presentation, the attitude. Mark Arm is a notorious smartass, and I think Kurt Cobain also wanted to be as smart and as witty and as, on point. Because when you hear Mark Arm and Steve Turner bantering, it's just like, these are some sharp people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They come off as being intelligent. They come off as being outsiders. But there's a big difference. In one of those intersections that I thought was really interesting is that Mark Arm he's very clear over and over again, I don't care what anybody else thinks, but for real. Like, for real. And same with Steve Turner and the rest of the band. They never compromised. They never compromised once. They never did anything for success. And that's where I think the path diverges, and you have to kind of think about the authenticity of Nirvana at that point. And I thought the most telling anecdote in the entire documentary was in talking about how after Nirvana had become successful, and then their former bandmates in Pearl Jam became very successful.
Oh, the comparison,
It's coming, yeah. And so they went on tour with Nirvana first, opening for them, and they were like, this is the grossest thing ever. The people working for Nirvana, I think to quote Mark,
they were surrounded with in their camp,
said that did not have the band's best interests at heart. They were also chest thumpers, he said.
In it for themselves.
They were in it for themselves and the money, and that the band didn't seem to know how to do what was right for itself and to remain true to itself. He was basically kind of calling them out as being, they just went down the corporate rabbit hole. And here's the great irony. When Green River, the origin band of Pearl Jam and Mudhoney, when they were together, they broke up after watching a Jane's Addiction show in L.A. And Jeff Ament and Stone were like, Green River could be as good as them.
Yeah.
And Mark Arm was just like, those guys suck. I never want to do anything like that. And that was the end of the band, because they're like, well, Mark doesn't want to do the corporate thing, and he's not going to do the corporate thing, but we want to do the corporate thing.
Yeah.
So we fast forward. So Mudhoney opens for Nirvana. They're just like dismayed by the state of affairs on being on the road with them. They're just like, these people are gross, we're not being treated well, and it's just awful. And they're like, oh God, we're going on the road with Pearl Jam coming up. What kind of nightmare, corporate nightmare is that going to be? And it turns out they had a great time, and they're like, the guys in Pearl Jam have actually surrounded themselves with a great team of people, and it was just a good time. And then they've done shows, and also they showed footage, of course, in the documentary, but they've been doing stuff together ever since. You know, they still get together and hang out. So I guess what I'm trying to say, and I guess my ultimate point in all of this, is that a lot of people have come to mythologize Nirvana, particularly Kurt Cobain, tortured poet, most authentic, voice of a generation kind of thing. And I think that he was just kind of misguided and damaged in a lot of ways. One of the interesting things, too, about watching Mark Arm talk about himself throughout the documentary is that not only is he self-effacing, but he's very upfront. He's like, well, I never did anything that I didn't want to do. I take full responsibility for everything that I have done, and I'm still out here working because I love it, and I do it for real, and I do it for myself and nobody else. He says it at the intro of the documentary. He's like, if you're making music, if you're doing stuff for other people, then you're fucked. And he's absolutely right. And there's an integrity there. And that's one thing that throughout the entire documentary, everybody that discusses the band or knows them says, these guys they're real, you know? They have 100% authenticity, which is one of the reasons why they were never that successful in relative terms. However, I see it as a huge success that somebody knew themselves well enough to get healthy and stay alive and buy a house and then work at Sub Pop, stocking the shelves as his adult job, and then goes out and gets to play rock shows for half the year. I think that is a hell of an inspiring story. And I think it's a hell of a lot more inspiring than wallowing in the memories and the detritus of Kurt Cobain's life. It's a shame what happened to him. I do not take away from the man's talent or pain. However, is it the story we should be talking about? Or should we be talking about Mark Arm's story?
Yeah, and we've talked about that on this channel before. We've had some revisiting of the grunge era and the damage that permeated it. And, there's a judgmental aspect to this, but for me, again, it increased my sympathy for Nirvana because, yes, on one hand, everybody made choices. They were in control of the choices they made. Nirvana could have resisted all, of the advances of the corporate interests. But, when I hear about them being surrounded by lousy people, it's like, well, some of that's choice, but some of it is circumstance. And I think but for a few good choices and a lot of good fortune could have gone other bands. Maybe Mudhoney would have been surrounded by predators and never even had the opportunity to develop what they developed. And also, to some extent, it is easy to say, I don't want any of that fame and gloss and glitter when the fame and gloss and glitter didn't want them in the first place. So having that kind of integrity is always a choice and always an accomplishment, but the public was not going to admire Mudhoney the same way that they admired Nirvana. I think there was an ability to be direct and accessible in Nirvana in a way that Mudhoney never would have had and wouldn't have chosen to have either. And so, but looking at the history of the bands that have come through and out of that scene, the ones that can do it their own way and stick to it and be functional and healthy, that really, I think, should be the story we hear more about, and not so much to judge Nirvana as to use them as the cautionary tale of what can happen when you're surrounded by the wrong people, when you make a few certain choices, and then when you get what the public put onto them, which must have been, an incredibly disorienting experience coming where they came from. So, yeah, I took away from this documentary, it's like we really should hear more about this group and this ethos. And it reminds me of the discussion we had about Devo a while back, where it's like this was a band with an identity and a purpose, and it wasn't determined by anything going on around it.
Nope.
And that's what we need to celebrate and use as the model for others to aspire to, not the burning out rather than fading away that is so often the case with guitar music.
Yeah. And the other thing, too, to keep in mind is that it's not like Mudhoney didn't have considerable success. They sold enough albums to create Sub Pop and keep them
hundreds
afloat.
of thousands of records.
Yeah. It's not like they were just some, they were a considerable force. And like I said, they went and introduced this music to Europe. So
they built the foundation for these huge bands.
It's it's nothing to sneeze at. The other thing I just wanted to, but going back to character once again, and I always have to dig at this guy because I don't like him. And I'm just going to say that. I'm going to own it. So Dan Peters, there was a brief moment in time during the height of Mudhoney's late 80s success where Steve decided he was going to go back to college. And he quit the band. And the band basically kept rehearsing and were kind of in this weird nebulous state. But Steve was like, I don't want to tour, And he's like, I don't want to do any of this stuff anymore for a while. And he's like, it's not real anyway. I need to go to college and get a degree. Anyway, long story short, Dan Peters, one of the most interesting drummers from the Seattle, scene, he needed a gig. And so the dudes in Nirvana had gotten rid of Chad Channing. And so they were like, Dan, you should come and play this show with us. They needed a drummer to do this kind of like showcase big show that they had. It was a show that was important, probably because record label people or somebody was there, but they needed a really good drummer. So they called up Mudhoney's drummer, Dan Peters, had him come down, do the show, do a photo shoot the next day to be on the cover of a magazine, one of the West Coast fanzine kind of things. And guess who was in the audience that night at that big show that they needed Dan Peters to play drums? It was Dave Grohl.
And at the photo shoot.
And Dave Grohl showed up to the photo shoot too, and he's just kind of hanging out. And Dan Peters, just deadpans at the camera. He's just like, well, they knew I wasn't going to be in the band. I called him and I was like, well, we're supposed to we're going to Europe. We're going to record this record. Dan Peters was supposed to be on Nevermind, basically, long story short. But Kurt and Chris knew that Dave Grohl was going to be the drummer. And they used Dan Peters just to get through that show because Grohl didn't know the set list yet. Did a photo shoot with him. If that doesn't tell you something about, though, the integrity of those people.
Yeah,
and this is before they were famous.
Yeah.
That tells me something.
Yeah.
And I'm going to leave it at that. And once again,
I don't. And that even wasn't the focus of the documentary, but like you said, there were little dots connecting throughout it that tell a story of that diverging path and how big a difference it can make, those little choices. So, cautionary tale, yes, but I think a lot of choices were made, and I really respect the hell out of Mudhoney, and I just think it's important that we try to remain objective and critical about things from the past that we often get very nostalgic about or become so mythologized that you can't even uncover the layers anymore. And if you want to know more about the Seattle scene and its development from Mr. Epp and the Calculations, which is Mr. Mark Arm in like 1981, all the way to now, still making music, looking great, you should learn more about him because he's a super cool dude and he's still around. All right, if you've watched the video to this point, please hit like and subscribe. Kevin, we can shake hands on camera. Thank you for bearing with another one of my reveal videos where I take a musical icon and try to take a crap on him. But if you made only to elevate
others, yes. If you made it this far, though, hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you next time.